Greetings. Father Mark signing on, continuing the series on the history of Catholicism in the United States. In this video, we will conclude the decade of the 1890s, which culminates with the condemnation of Americanism in 1899. So, continuing where we left off, brings us to the year 1897, the Fourth International Catholic Scientific Congress, held in Freiburg, Switzerland, on the occasion of the 300th anniversary of the death of St. Peter Canisius. Ultramontane Catholics, conservatives, as we'd say today, were never comfortable with this gathering, or even the idea of such a gathering of Catholic scientists, just because of the way the term science was used, and the way that in the 19th century, and the way that scientists and science were so often used to attack and ridicule the church. But up to this point in 1897, the gathering had not been offensive enough to merit any sort of condemnation. And on the positive side, it did provide the opportunity to identify potential subversives and modernists. One of the speakers on the agenda was none other than Monsignor Dennis O'Connell, longtime protege of Cardinal Gibbons of Baltimore. For O'Connell to even appear in such a venue only 1 year after being fired from the North American College for his association with Americanism scandalized many. So Dennis O'Connell was born in County Cork, Ireland. Father's name Michael, mother's name Bridget. The family moved to the United States, settling in Columbia, South Carolina, where Dennis's father Michael had two brothers who were priests. So in other words, Dennis O'Connell had two uncles who were already priests, serving in South Carolina. They were the Reverends Jeremiah and Joseph O'Connell. Under the influence of his priest uncles, Dennis chose to pursue an ecclesiastical life. In 1868, age 19, Dennis was accepted into minor seminary at the alma mater of the future Cardinal James Gibbons, St. Charles College in Ellicott City, Maryland. He came to the attention of the then Bishop James Gibbons. At the time, Gibbons was still apostolic vicar for the state of North Carolina. He evidently impressed Bishop Gibbons, as this resulted in Dennis being sent for major seminary to Rome in 1871 to study at the North American College. O'Connell was ordained in Rome May 26, 1877, and upon returning to the United States, Gibbons, who was by then Bishop of Richmond, Virginia, appointed the new Father O'Connell as rector of St. Peter's Church in Richmond. In preparation for that same year, 1877, Gibbons was appointed coadjutor, Archbishop of Baltimore, to the aging and infirm Archbishop Martin Spalding, and then Spalding passed away soon after, so Gibbons became Archbishop. Well, part of the vesture of an archbishop is a pallium, which is it's a stylized yoke, ox's yoke. It's made from wool by a special order of nuns in Rome, and it's presented every year on the solemnity of Saints Peter and Paul, June 29th. Well, Gibbons elected not to go personally, but instead sent Father O'Connell to retrieve it for him and bring it to Baltimore in time for Gibbons' installation as Archbishop on October 3rd, 1877. 7 years later, when the Third Council of Baltimore met in 1884, Gibbons appointed O'Connell as his secretary. After the council ended, he sent O'Connell to Rome to deliver the official copy of the final documents. The following year, 1885, through Gibbon's persuasion, O'Connell was appointed rector of his alma mater, the North American College in Rome. In this capacity for the next decade, he also functioned as an unofficial spy and agent in Rome for the Americanist prelates like Gibbons. 2 years later, in 1887, O'Connell was appointed domestic prelate, which was one of the ranks that granted him the title of Monsignor. Before Vatican II, there were 14. There had grown to 14 ranks that would do that. Then after Vatican II, it was reduced to three ranks. And Pope Francis, at least at the time I'm making this video, I think it was in 2013 or 14, Pope Francis suspended the awarding of any of the titles that carried, any of the ranks that carried the title Monsignor. Now, he did not, those who had already been named previously, he did not, depose. He did not take the rank away from him, but he suspended awarding it. And, that's the, anyway. So, in 1895, 96, for the reasons already covered, O'Connell was fired from his position as rector of the North American College owing to his association with the ecclesiology of Americanism, which by that point Rome was regarding with increasing suspicion. So, nevertheless, not even 2 years later, about a year and a half later, utterly without shame, O'Connell was comfortably ensconced in the Church of Santa Maria in Trastevere in Rome. Now, that was the titular church of Cardinal Gibbons in Rome. So Gibbons could just could decide who he wanted to appoint there, and he appointed O'Connell. So O'Connell in Rome, visiting Switzerland for the Fourth International Catholic Scientific Congress was not difficult for him. And also lacking in prudence, he chose to do this, not only to attend, but to make a presentation. He regarded it as an opportunity to vindicate himself in the eyes of the world, because he felt that his being fired from the position of rector of the NAC was unjust. The ego of these people. So he was fired because of his association with Americanism. So his presentation was titled "The Two Americanisms," in which he argued, clearly in defending himself, he argued that civic Americanism, which was he defined as the constitutional secularism, the official secularism of the United States, enabled religious Americanism to be so successful. So the distinction, like civic Americanism, he would define as patriotism, just simple patriotism. And for a Catholic, this means, at least from in O'Connell's presentation, this means embracing the American separation of church and state. Whereas he defined religious Americanism as an ecclesiology which held constitutional secularism as an ideal to be pursued. This was only 2 years after, remember 1895, we covered in the last video, Pope Leo XIII issued an encyclical addressed to the United States, Longinque Oceani, in which he clarified it was not permissible to hold up the American model of separation of church and state as the ideal for the world to pursue. Catholics could live under that system, but not articulate it as an ideal, because de facto it results in the quarantining of religion from public life. So O'Connell, uses his presentation at this venue to advocate the exact opposite of what the Pope had just articulated 2 years earlier. At the same Congress, another address was given by an American priest. This one was a member of the Congregation of the Holy Cross, and he was a faculty member of the university that established by that congregation, the University of Notre Dame in South Bend, Indiana. The name of this priest was Father John Augustine Zahm, Z-A-H-M. Born in Ohio, 1851, Zahm attended the University of Notre Dame and was ordained a Holy Cross priest in 1875. Zahm was an unabashed, unconcealed Americanist. He explored rivers in South America. He was a personal friend of Theodore Roosevelt and a firm believer in the power and potential of modern science and engineering to improve the world, and believed that the Catholic Church should fully endorse and participate in this. However, the topic of his address in 1897 was even more controversial than Americanism. This was the theory of natural selection, or Charles Darwin's theory of natural selection, which later and still today is conventionally referred to as evolution, the theory of evolution, and the relationship of this to Catholic dogma. So Father Zahm had written on this issue previously, but in those cases he published under a false name, J.H. Mozans, M-O-Z-A-N-S. So in this presentation, at this event, he went public in 1897 under his own name. So in the course of his address, Zahm admitted that at the time, meaning late 19th century, most theists, not just Catholics, but most theists, those who believe in a deity, as distinct from atheists, that most theists believed that they could not accept evolution without denying their faith. He rejected that assertion, and he proposed in this address and defended what he described as Christian Darwinism. In his articulation, Christian Darwinism accepted natural selection, evolution, as a general principle, but one within God's creation. That God created it as part, like gravity, that it was just part of the laws of nature as created by God. Whereas Christian Darwinism did not have to take sides on any of the theoretical specifics. So not everyone who believed in Darwinism or believed in evolution agreed in all the details. So at the time in the late 19th century, there were two primary divisions. There were those who regarded natural selection, evolution, as taking place according to gradualism, and the other interpretation was that it took place according to punctuated equilibrium. So they both, within the secular Darwinist sphere, they all accepted natural selection as the mode by which evolution unfolded, but they disagreed on how natural selection manifested. So gradualism believed there were tiny variations in each generation that accumulated, whereas punctuated equilibrium held that you could have generations and generations where there were no noticeable biological changes, yet then all of a sudden, something happened and there was a leap forward. Anyway, so Zahm said, that Christian Darwinists could accept natural selection as part of God's design without taking sides on that issue. Instead, Christian Darwinists could accept that God created nature with the potential to unfold and develop. Just as, an infant, grows and develops into an adult. That's part of, we accept that's just part of God's design. So Zom further asserted that God gave to all living things, plants, insects, animals, humans, two characteristics as part of their created nature. First, adaptive flexibility to cope with change. That, the survival instinct. Second, an innate power to reproduce offspring of increasing ability and complexity. Meaning, Zom argued, that God programmed species with the potential to develop into new species. So understood in that general way, Zom concluded, there was nothing intrinsically contrary to the faith in evolutionary thinking. Evolution was, in his modified presentation, part of the natural law given by God to creation. Now, such a general Christian Darwinism would enable the faithful to continue to acknowledge God as creator and source of all life, while at the same time learn and enjoy, at least in Zom's presentation, what he regarded as the exciting new discoveries in paleontology and science. So this, as with these conferences, the speeches were all written out and then they were published. And people could buy all the speeches, from one of these conventions were published in book form, and you could buy it. So it got to the attention of the Vatican, and so the next year, September of 1898, in response, the Vatican issued a decree prohibiting Zom's work on Christian Darwinism to continue. Now, the decree did not include a reason, nor did it excommunicate Zom. So it did not say, okay, Father Zom made 5 points and point 2 is erroneous, therefore it didn't do that. It just said they prohibited him to continue teaching and publishing on this. And to his credit, Zom he obeyed. He immediately ceased publishing on the matter, and he contacted his publishers to halt any translations of his work that might have been in progress. Now, I'll jump out of the chronology a moment, seminarians, so you have all this together. The most recent papal statement on the matter, at least that I'm aware of, took place on October 31st, 2008, when the then Pope, Benedict XVI, addressed the Pontifical Academy of Science, which had chosen evolution as the topic for its meeting that year. So I'll just give an excerpt to demonstrate the Pope's theological perspective on the matter. His words, quote, "In order to develop and evolve, the world must first be, and thus have come from nothing into being. It must be created. In other words, by the first being, who is such by essence. To state that the foundation of the cosmos and its developments is the provident wisdom of the Creator is not to say that creation has only to do with the beginning of the history of the world and of life. It implies, rather, that the Creator founds these developments and supports them, underpins them, and sustains them continuously. Thomas Aquinas taught that the notion of creation must transcend the horizontal origin of the unfolding of events, which is history, and consequently all our purely naturalistic ways of thinking and speaking about the evolution of the world. Thomas observed that creation is neither a movement nor a mutation. It is instead the foundational and continuing relationship that links the creature to the Creator. For the Creator is the cause of every being and of all becoming. Okay, so you see, there's a distinction between what Father Zom articulated and the way Benedict explained. So Zahm's articulation of Christian Darwinism was that natural selection, evolution, the way we, so that Catholics would not, go into the, atheism, would be that natural selection is part of the programming, so to speak, is part of the natural law that God created, and it just unfolded that way. Well, that's a little too deist for Pope Benedict's thinking. So instead, he regards it as that all the change. So he's not denying that changes have taken place, that species have developed, but he's saying, instead of just unfolding according to a mindless process, even one that had its origin in God, instead all of those changes continuously are part of God's plan and take part in accord with God's plan. So that's an important distinction. Now, this was just it was an address. It was not encyclical. It was not an apostolic constitution. So, but still, the Pope said it. It's good enough for me. All right, back to the chronology. The Spanish-American War, 1898, had its origin. Nothing just happened. So this had its origin, at least proximate origin, 3 years earlier, 1895, when the population of the island of Cuba, well, at least, significant, I'm not saying every single person, but significant elements numerically on the island of Cuba began fighting for their independence from Spain. At the time, Cuba was still a colony of Spain, and they wanted their independence. Stories, and there was fighting. Spain wanted to keep the colony as it was lucrative for sugar production. So the fighting got very ugly, and stories of atrocities routinely appeared in American newspapers, resulting in vocal demands by some for American intervention. The president at the time, we met in our last video, president number 25, was William McKinley. He did not want to intervene. He was an isolationist. And he was the last veteran of the Civil War to be elected president. So he had seen enough fighting in his, he didn't want any more wars. And that's probably where it would have stopped. Except an American warship, the Uss Maine, Maine is in the state of Maine, USS Maine, was dispatched to Havana to protect American interest and to protect or evacuate any Americans on the island. On February 15th, 1898, the USS Maine sank after a mysterious explosion. Spain believed that the Americans sank the Maine deliberately in order to give them a cause for war, while Americans believed it sank because of a Spanish mine in the harbor. Regardless, it was enough. The outrage was sufficient for a declaration of war. But the United States declared war on Spain, not on Cuba, on Spain. But Cuba was a colony of Spain. So war was waged between the United States and Spain from April through August of 1898, culminating in a victory for the United States. In the concluding treaty, signed in December of 1898, Spain ceded to the United States control of 4 of its colonies, its insular colonies, island colonies, Cuba and Puerto Rico in the Caribbean, in the Pacific, Guam, and the Philippine Islands. Now, the Philippines is an archipelago, so it's many, many islands. Not just one island, but still it was considered one colony, even though it was multiple islands. It was considered one colony, so it's 4 colonies, but more than 4 islands that Spain ceded to the United States after losing the war. Those last 2 acquisitions, Guam and the Philippine Islands, are what later brought the United States into what Japan regarded as its sphere of influence. So it is therefore not surprising that when the Second World War began, Japan directed an attack against the American bases on the Philippine Islands. But we'll get to that later in the course, if I live long enough to get that far, considering how long it's taken me to get this far. Anyway, the defeat of Spain in 5 months was shocking to Europe and to the Vatican in particular. Spain was a Catholic country, completely shamed in a war against a Protestant country. I know the Vatican, officially the United States was not religious, but the Vatican, certainly in the late 19th century, never believed the American claims of separation of church and state. They continued to view it simply as a Protestant Masonic republic. American prelates, for the most part, a majority, not every single one, but well over half, American prelates, not only supported the war against the Catholic country of Spain, but were very loud in their denunciation of the Catholic country of Spain. Now, to Roman ears, this went far beyond simple patriotism or simple obedience to civil authority. And instead, like the bishops went farther than they had to. They could have said, separation of church and state, we can't comment on foreign policy. But instead, the bishops, Catholic bishops, are publicly siding with Protestants against Catholics in a purely political conflict that caused loss of life. And that was the last straw. Americanism would be condemned 1 month later, 1 month after the treaty was signed, the final treaty was signed. So the treaty was signed in December of 1898. The next month, January 22nd, 1899, Pope Leo XIII did the deed. He condemned Americanism in terms of a warning to resist the temptation of allowing a secular notion of civil liberty to undermine the timeless truth of faith. So the document was titled in the Latin, Testem Benevolentiae Nostrae, Witness Our Goodwill. Here's an exemplar quote. His words: "We indeed," he's using the we, the head of state, like we the Pope, we the Holy See. "We indeed have no thought of rejecting everything that modern industry and study has produced. So far from it that we welcome to the patrimony of truth and to an ever-widening scope of public well-being, whatsoever helps toward the progress of learning and virtue. Yet, all of this, to be of any solid benefit, nay, to have a real existence and growth, can only be on the condition of recognizing the wisdom and authority of the Church." Okay, so I'll summarize the rest. So Leo specifies that he's not condemning the United States. He's not condemning Americans. He's not saying that Americans cannot live in the United States, that Catholic Americans cannot obey the laws of the United States. He specifies that he was responding to opinions expressed in the French translation of the biography of Isaac Hecker, which we covered previously, by Walter Elliott. And remember that was actually not a translation. It was in French, but it was a paraphrase, a condensing of the American original, and paraphrased into French. So Leo specifies he's responding to opinions expressed in that French translation, and he is not condemning. He even specifies that he was not condemning Father Hecker personally, who died in 1888, so 11 years earlier. So extracting from that, as well as other, repeated iterations of Americanism, the Pope extracted 7 items that Catholics could not believe and still remain in a right relationship with the Church. So prohibited belief number 1 was that the Holy Spirit was more active in the present age than in the past. Prohibited belief number 2. Direct inspiration by the Holy Spirit into the individual soul eliminates the need for spiritual direction. Prohibited belief number 3. The active virtues are superior to the passive virtues, like humility. Prohibited belief number 4. Religious vows are obsolete in this age, meaning, the modern age from their perspective. Late 19th century, on the threshold, only 1 year away from the turn into the 20th century, because they inhibit liberty. So that's a prohibited belief. Prohibited belief number 5. The church needs new methods to adapt the message to the age. You remember the distinction we made as far back, seminarians, as far back as the patristics course, of the intro to that first lecture, that intro lecture to the first course. The method of presentation can be adapted, but the message itself cannot be changed, because it's not our message. It's Jesus' message. So we cannot adapt, we cannot change that message. But we can adapt the way it's presented. Like as St. Paul wrote his letters in Greek, not in Hebrew or Aramaic. Prohibited belief number 6. The church in America should be different from the rest of the world. Prohibited belief number 7. Individual liberty should be introduced into the church, freeing it from the monarchical model of authority by divine right. So that's conciliarism, you remember from the medieval course. And that's how, when I say, Leo condemned Americanism, it's Americanism defined in that way, according to those 7 characteristics. So he's not condemning patriotism. He's not saying Catholics cannot be patriotic. Catholics cannot love their country. And only that a Catholic may not believe those 7 things. All right. So Cardinal Gibbons, Bishop Ireland, Bishop Keane, O'Connell, who later would become a bishop himself, all the Americanists we covered, they all individually sent letters to the Pope, Leo XIII, submitting to the encyclical. Said, "Oh, of course, Holy Father, naturally we agree with everything you said." But each one of them pointed out, "Well, we never believed that," to start with. So those of us who are Americanist, in the sense that O'Connell presented in 1897, we never believed those things anyway. And they asserted that Hecker never believed those things. And as we covered previously, several of these, especially Gibbons and Keane especially, had a personal relationship with Hecker. And Hecker was Keane's spiritual director. So, but Leo specified in there, he was not accusing Hecker of asserting all these things, but these are ideas. These seven propositions were ideas that were articulated in response to the French paraphrase of the biography of Hecker. Now, as we saw, that this had been going on for a while, as far back as Longínquo Ossiani in 1895, and then one thing after another, all of Archbishop Ireland's statements on education, O'Connell's statement at the Congress. But I think what really triggered it was the Spanish-American War, was American bishops denouncing a Catholic country, which they didn't have to do. They could have just remained silent, but denouncing a Catholic country and supporting a Protestant country in a war against the Catholic country, not for the faith on either side, but just purely for political expansionism. I think that's what finally triggered it. Okay, Leo left it at that, but the condemnation remains. It has never been reversed. So Americanism, as defined according to those 7 characteristics, may not be believed by a Catholic. Okay, late 19th century, there are a number of places where we could have put this, but since we're transitioning, in the next video we'll move into the 20th century, so this is as good a place as any to cover it. And this is progressivism, capital P. I mean, it refers to a movement in American history, American politics. So progressivism, background. From the earliest days of the Republic, which we covered earlier in this playlist, there emerged a movement to promote humanitarian improvement, which included public education, women's rights, treatment of criminals, just wages, just working hours for laborers, insurance for the elderly and injured, abolition of slavery, abolition of child labor, etc., and on and on and on. So these humanitarian initiatives. In its origin, not only, so humanitarian initiatives, but specifically this movement regarded it as a proper role for government to involve itself in all of these issues, to improve, for the government to undertake humanitarian initiatives, even though that's not in the Constitution. It's not forbidden in the Constitution either. It's not part of the list of what the founders envisioned. Apart from the general, life, liberty, pursuit of happiness, promote the general welfare and that kind of thing. So in its origin, this movement from the early national period was driven in its origin by private associations of Protestant clergy, particularly Unitarians and Quakers, not exclusively, but they were among the leaders, following what was then called the social gospel. We covered that earlier, 1820s, actually after the early national period, but say 1820s, with the Second Great Awakening in American religious history. The first was during the colonial period. This was the second. So this is the social gospel movement. Not only that they as churches would promote these humanitarian initiatives, but that they would organize and use their numbers and to essentially form lobbies, what we call today lobbies, that would raise money and publish ideas and support political candidates who would further their agenda of involving the government in humanitarian initiatives, and that they would be funded through tax theft. So this group, the early social gospel group, concluded that they could achieve maximum success by using the political process to secure the election of individuals who would use the apparatus of government to enforce social change. And examples we've already covered earlier include the public school movement from in the 1830s that had its origin in the 1830s, and of course the abolition of slavery. And abolitionism dates back from that period, but it did not finally occur in the Constitution until it took the Civil War for that to happen. But all of that, those were considered victories for the social gospel movement, in the sense that the Constitution, as articulated, does not articulate humanitarian initiatives as a role for government, for the federal government. It does not forbid it, but it just doesn't mention it. So those were both the public school movement as well as abolition of slavery were cases where these guys got their way, where the government did involve itself in humanitarian causes in a direction that the social gospel movement regarded as positive. As with most areas of American life, in fact, all areas of American life, the Civil War was a turning point, such that there's before and after. It's like after, nothing was ever going to be the same after the Civil War, and all initiatives were just drowned in blood in the Civil War, as that it consumed everything. But so after the war, the pre-movements, and this is in literature, economics, art, architecture, and all that movements before the Civil War. Some of them occurred after the Civil War, but they had to be reinvented or reformulated after the Civil War. And when they were, it was in a noticeably different form. And that occurred with the social gospel movement. So after the war, the social gospel movement, meaning the movement to use the government as a means of imposing social improvement, was reformulated in its post-Civil War manifestation. In its post-war form, the social gospel movement was more secular and more political and it was led by individuals who did not always have a religious affiliation. So this post-Civil War articulation of social gospel philosophy as a political theology is therefore renamed so as not to confuse it. And so it's renamed as Progressivism, because many of the leaders were not religious, and so they would not accept the gospel as being their motive. They believed secular humanitarian ideals were sufficient. Now there were in the progressive movement there were still social gospel types, meaning religious types, even those who were ministers, clergy in their churches, that would be involved. But the post-Civil War articulation was much more secular and political. So just for the sake of clarity, but they both had the same idea: is that to organize politically and publish to get their ideas out, and then lobby, and support political candidates who shared their philosophy that the government could and should, the coercive power of government could and should be used to implement social improvement, and that it should be funded by tax theft. All right, so in the period between the condemnation of Americanism in 1899 and the Great Depression, which began in 1929, progressivism reshaped the political and economic dynamics of the nation. Now, while there remained some who opposed it, the movement nevertheless was largely unstoppable, from that point on. Now there was a pendulum, would swing. It was like in foreign policy, from the Spanish-American War on, the American foreign policy would oscillate between interventionism and isolationism. But the interventionism never really went away. It would become quiescent for a time, depending on who was in power, but it never really went away because after the Spanish-American War, the United States was a colonial power. We had 4 colonies. I mean, that for reasons of vanity and, preening self-righteousness, they were called that way, the protectorates, instead of, but they were colonies. And so also in domestic policy, the progressivism, the idea that the government could and should impose solutions for social problems and fund those solutions through tax theft, it never really went away after this point. It oscillated depending on who was in power, be more aggressive or less aggressive, but it never really went away. And both are still with us. The interventionist foreign policy as well as the activist government, socially activist government. Okay. So to conclude the decade and the century, the Treaty of Paris was the instrument by which officially ended the Spanish-American War. It was signed on December 10th, 1898, and in which, as I said, Spain ceded 4 colonies to the United States, 2 in the Caribbean, Cuba and Puerto Rico, and 2 in the Pacific, Guam and the Philippine archipelago. 1899, February 4th, 1 month after the condemnation of Americanism, and 1 year after Spain ceded the Philippine archipelago to the United States, the Philippine-American War commenced, when a Filipino nationalist named Emilio Aguinaldo, and I'll spell it, and if I mispronounce it, apologies, but it's spelled Aguinaldo, lived from 1869 to 1964. He rejected the transfer of sovereignty over the Philippine archipelago from Spain to the United States. And instead, he said that it should be independent. The island should be independent. So he led the War of Independence, in the name of a republic. So the Philippine archipelago consisted of 7,100 islands, clustered 500 miles off the coast of Asia. The capital of Manila is on the island of Luzon, Luzon. The archipelago was subjugated by Spain in 1565, which imposed a colonial government on the indigenous people and lasted for 4 centuries until 1898. Okay, so 1 year after the Spanish-American War, there was a Philippine-American War, in the course of which the American general Lwell S. Otis, O-T-I-S, eliminated the field army, the Philippine Field Army, by November of 1899. But Aguinaldo was still at liberty, so he then moved to small unit tactics, insurrectionary tactics, or guerrilla tactics, as they'd be called later. Not guerrilla like the animal, G-O-R-I-L-L-A, but guerrilla. So guerre is the word for war. So guerrilla is a little war, meaning small scale operations. Not that it's a small war, but small units of men operating clandestinely, doing hit and run tactics, could cause a great deal of damage. And it's very difficult for an army that's organized for large scale engagements, like the American Army, to respond to this. So the Americans countered this insurrection, these insurrectionary tactics, with a policy called Benevolent Assimilation. Quote, that's the Benevolent Assimilation. It was divide and conquer, essentially, and that's the old Roman way, divisio et regio, which succeeded in dividing the Philippine population, and so the minority left that was still wanted to fight for independence were then bereft of support, at least of the scope of support that they would have needed. So this resulted in the identification and capture of rebel leaders, including Aguinaldo, and which ended hostilities on July 4th, 1902. Same year, 1899, the Secretary of State for the United States, John Hay, Hay, who we first met him earlier on this playlist. He was one of President Lincoln's secretaries. And now he's stayed in public life and became Secretary of State. So in 1899, he formulated the open door policy, as that was what it was called, the open door policy. It was a political foreign policy, but really economic. I mean, it was an economic policy masquerading as a foreign policy. And open door policy demanded equal trading rights and equal access to China for the United States. As we covered earlier in the playlist, China still existed at this point, though the monarchy, its days were numbered. But officially, China was still a monarchy, and that monarchy was completely ineffective. So China de facto had been partitioned into economic spheres of influence by the European powers and Japan. Now, the United States had just become, the previous year in 1898, had just become a power in the Pacific after acquiring the former Spanish colonies of Guam and the Philippines. So in that year, he said, okay, we have a base. We have bases in the Pacific, so we want a sphere of influence in China. And so rather than ask, for a new partition, he just declared open door that the American merchants should have access to all the economic spheres within China. This is all part of. It fits within the Gilded Age, as it was called. This was an age of the Industrial Age, the early Industrial Age. Well, this is the Second Industrial Age, but really the first the first Industrial Age started in Europe and with England. England industrialized before we did. So by the time it came to us in world history, it's the Second Industrial Age, but it's the first for us, and that overlapped. And so we appropriated that as well as capitalism, which England had been experimenting with since the 16th century, and so we appropriated that after 2 centuries of development. So the industrial age and the capitalist age synthesized in the late 19th century to make the United States profoundly prosperous and very quickly, prosper very quickly. So we have, as a sort of a conclusion for the century, for the 19th century, and then the next video we'll move to the 20th century. Here we have a contemporaneous, meaning written in 1899, analysis of the moral effects of the Gilded Age. And it's a pretty negative assessment. So this was composed by a guy named Thorstein Veblen, Veblen, in an essay titled The Theory of the Leisure Class, published 1899. So here's an excerpt from Chapter 4. His words: "In what has been said of the evolution of the vicarious leisure class and its differentiation from the general body of the working classes, reference has been made to a further division of labor, that between different servant classes. One portion of the servant class, chiefly those persons whose occupation is vicarious leisure, come to undertake a new subsidiary range of duties, the vicarious consumption of goods. The most obvious form in which this consumption occurs is seen in the wearing of liveries and the occupation of spacious servants' quarters. Another, scarcely less obtrusive or less effective form of vicarious consumption, and a much more widely prevalent one, is the consumption of food, clothing, dwelling, and furniture by the lady of the house and the rest of the domestic establishment." All right, so, now nobody writes this way anymore. So what he's talking about is conspicuous consumption as part of the Gilded Age, is, what he regarded as one of the vices of the age was an inordinate expenditure of resources on leisure, by a class who was not in need. They certainly had enough to eat, enough, shelter for the family and everything. So this is part of the critique, is all those resources were consumed just to make the lives of that tiny strata of the population more opulent and luxurious, while, by contrast, a much larger swath of the population was certainly poor. And of that swath of the population that was poor, there was a strata that was in real destitution. Real hunger. Meaning, there's some days no food, and on all days never enough food. All right, that was from Chapter 4. Skipping down to Chapter 7, his words: "It will be in place, by way of illustration, to show in some detail how the economic principles so far set forth apply to everyday facts, in some one direction of the life process. For this purpose, no line of consumption affords a more apt illustration than expenditure on clothing. It is especially the rule of the conspicuous waste of goods that finds expression in clothing, although the other related principles of pecuniary repute are also exemplified in the same contrivances. Other methods of putting one's pecuniary standing in public evidence serve their end effectually, and other methods are in vogue always and everywhere. But expenditure on clothing has this advantage over most other methods, that our clothing is always in evidence and always affords an indication of our pecuniary standing to all observers at the first glance. It is also true that admitted expenditures for display is more obviously present and is perhaps more universally practiced in the matter of clothing than in any other line of consumption. No one finds difficulty in assenting to the commonplace that the greater part of the expenditure incurred by all classes for clothing is incurred for the sake of a respectable appearance, rather than for the protection of the person. And probably at no other point is the sense of shabbiness so keenly felt as it is if we fall short by the standards set by social usage in the matter of clothing. It is true, clothing in even a higher degree than most other items of consumption, that people will undergo a very considerable degree of privation in the comforts or even the necessities of life in order to avoid what is considered a decent amount of wasteful consumption, so that it is by no means an uncommon occurrence in an inclement climate for people to go ill-clad in order to appear well-dressed. And the commercial value of the goods used for clothing in any modern community is made up to a much larger extent of the fashionableness, the reputability of the goods, over their mechanical service, which they render in clothing the person of the wearer. The need of dress is eminently a higher or spiritual need. All right, so you see his point that the conspicuous consumption, that it's not just to protect the body from the or cover the body from the elements, but he makes a point that that's someone if would spend money on a suit that may not be that warm and actually deprive themselves of other things, but things that people don't see, but just so they're well dressed, and so that would make them appear to be of a higher class, and make them appear to be more prosperous than they actually were, even if the clothing was impractical. So part of what he's critiquing is that a guy would rather wear a suit, a summer suit in winter if it looks good, rather than wear a shabby overcoat. Because even if he's physically uncomfortable, he'll look like he's of a higher class. He'll look like he's more successful. And then that would make others believe that he is, in fact, more successful. Anyway, so that's part of the critique. I could go on and on, but you get the point. The point in not only articulating what was happening in the late 19th and into the, as we transition into the 20th century, but also that there were observers who recognized what was happening at the time. Okay, so next we move into the 20th century, the decade of the 1900s. President number 26, Theodore Roosevelt, was president from 1901 through 1909, and for reasons in a way that we'll see. Follow President McKinley. So for now, we will pause, and the next video we'll move into the 1900s, into the 20th century. So for now, thank you for your attention. This session is adjourned.